The winter wind in Queens had a way of biting through a man's coat, making the bones feel older than they were. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was just a skinny kid then, but already he carried himself like someone the streets owed respect. His neighborhood wasn't the kind you escaped by accident. You either fought your way out, or you became part of it. For Gotti, fighting wasn't just survival, it was a kind of education. He grew up in a cramped, run-down apartment, one of 13 kids crammed into too little space. His father worked irregular jobs, never bringing home enough, and his mother stretched pennies until they screamed. Money was always a problem, and the kids learned early that if you wanted something, you didn't wait, you took it. John learned that lesson before he hit his teens. The streets around Fulton Rockaway weren't just rough, they were a training ground for future convicts. Bookmakers ran numbers on the corner. Men with slick hair and long coats leaned on storefront walls, whispering about collections and shipments. The cops walked their beats, but they weren't the law here. The law was whatever the local crew boss decided it was. Gotti watched them closely, not with fear, but with the curiosity of someone studying his future. By the time he was 12, he was running errands for small-time hustlers. Sometimes it was delivering envelopes. Other times it was standing lookout while someone cleaned out a truck's cargo. It was fast money, easy money, and it carried a kind of thrill. He'd hand the cash to his mother like it was nothing, never saying where it came from. She'd scold him, call him reckless, but she didn't send it back. In a place where poverty was a constant shadow, that kind of money had a way of silencing morals. At 14, Gotti was already in trouble with the law. Petty thefts, gambling in alleys, fights with other crews. None of it scared him. If anything, it hardened him. When the cops roughed him up, he didn't snitch. That kind of silence didn't go unnoticed. In the streets, keeping your mouth shut was worth more than gold. The older guys started to take him seriously, and John soaked in their approval like it was oxygen. One man in particular caught his attention. Carmine Fatico, a Gambino captain who ran the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club out of Ozone Park. Fatico's crew had the kind of reach most neighborhood toughs could only dream about. They weren't just shaking down store owners, they had their hands in everything. Construction, hijackings, gambling operations that stretched across boroughs. And unlike the desperate petty crooks on the street, they looked sharp. Suits pressed, shoes shined, rings on their fingers. They didn't blend in, they stood out. John liked that. It wasn't just about the money, it was about presence. You walked into a room and every head turned. You didn't beg for respect. It was already there, hanging in the air like the smell of expensive cigars. That was the life Gotti wanted. The first real score came when he was just 16, a truck hijacking down near Idlewild Airport back before it was JFK. The job was sloppy, the getaway barely clean, but the payoff was more money than he'd ever seen at once. That night, lying in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, John didn't feel fear. He felt something far more dangerous, certainty. He knew exactly what he was meant to be. From then on, he wasn't just another kid hanging around corners, he was moving in circles that came with higher stakes and higher risks. And in those circles, you didn't just make friends, you made allies, enemies, and debts that could get you killed. John Gotti was still just a teenager, but in the eyes of the neighborhood, he was no longer a boy. He was a name. And in the world he was stepping into, a name was everything. The kind of everything that could get you killed before you turned 21. The air in Queens always seemed heavy in the summer, thick with heat, exhaust fumes, and the smell of fried food from street vendors. By now, John Gotti was 17, and he'd grown into his confidence. The skinny kid had filled out into a young man with a boxer's build. Broad shoulders, quick hands, and the kind of swagger that told you he'd throw the first punch without hesitation. He wasn't just hanging around the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club anymore. He was running errands directly for Carmine Fatico's crew. Small at first, but steady, collections from bookies who'd fallen behind, drops to men who were too careful to be seen together in public. Even the occasional intimidation job, where Gotti's job wasn't to hit anyone, but to stand there, smiling, while someone else did the talking. He'd learned that a calm, confident presence could rattle a man as much as a fist. But the petty jobs weren't enough for him anymore. Gotti had ambition, and ambition in the mob world meant risk. Hijacking was where the real money was, especially in New York in the early 1960s. The docks and airports were overflowing with cargo, clothing, liquor, electronics, and most of it was barely guarded. If you knew the schedules, if you had the right inside guy, you could make a score worth thousands in a single night. That's how Gotti got involved in what would become one of his first defining moments, the cigarette hijack. It was supposed to be simple. Word had come down about a truck carrying a fresh shipment of high-end cigarettes. Cigarettes were gold on the street, easy to move, and the profit margin was huge. The crew was small. 2 older guys Gotti knew from the club and another young up-and-comer named Angelo Ruggiero, who'd become one of his closest friends in life. The job went down after midnight, near the airport. They tailed the truck, waited for a quiet stretch, then boxed it in. Gotti moved fast. He yanked the driver out, shoved him into the back of a sedan, and within minutes, they were rolling the rig toward a warehouse in Brooklyn. It was clean. Too clean. That should have been the warning. 2 days later, the cops came knocking. Somebody had talked, or maybe they'd been seen. Either way, Gotti was in cuffs for the first time on a real charge, grand larceny. At the precinct, they tried to work him over. Where did the shipment go? Who was with him? Gotti didn't say a word, not even when they threatened him with the full sentence. It was his first real test, and he passed it. In the eyes of the crew, he'd proven himself. Still, it meant doing time. It wasn't much, just a short stint, but prison, even for a few months, changes a man. For Gotti, it wasn't fear that stuck with him. It was observation. He watched how the older wise guys moved inside. They didn't beg for anything. Guards called them sir. Other inmates gave them space. They carried themselves like they owned the place because in a way they did. Respect followed them even into the cage. When Gotti walked out, he wasn't just some kid from the neighborhood anymore. He was Johnny Boy to the men who mattered. And with that name came opportunity. By the early 1960s, Carmine Fatico had shifted more of his operation toward the airport. JFK was a gold mine for the Gambinos. Shipments came in from all over the world, and the union guys who worked the docks were either on the payroll or too scared to interfere. Gotti found himself running more and more jobs out there, sometimes stealing cargo, sometimes guarding it for a price. One night in '63, he and Angelo were assigned to a truck loaded with expensive clothing. They were supposed to unload it into a warehouse the crew controlled. But instead, Gotti made a call to a fence he trusted and moved half the shipment on the side. It was a gamble, skimming from a score that wasn't technically his, but he knew how to cover his tracks. The boss got his cut, the books showed nothing missing, and Gotti pocketed extra cash. It was a lesson he'd carry for life. Always find a way to make a little more than you're supposed to. The jobs got bigger, but so did the heat. The Port Authority cops were watching the airport closer, and the FBI had begun to take an interest in the Gambino operations there. Gotti was smart, but he wasn't untouchable, not yet. In 1965, a hijacking went wrong. The driver fought back, and in the struggle, a cop on patrol spotted them. Angelo got away clean, but Gotti took a bad fall trying to vault a fence. His ankle shattered, and the cops scooped him up before he could limp more than a few feet. This time, the sentence was longer, 3 years. Prison wasn't a nightmare for him. It was a classroom. He made connections, learned how the mob operated in other cities, and most importantly, he studied leadership. He saw how some men ruled with fear, others with loyalty, and the best with a balance of both. Gotti decided early on that he'd be the kind of man people wanted to follow, not just had to. By the time he walked out in 1968, he had a reputation, not as a boss yet, but as a loyal earner who kept his mouth shut and could handle himself. That's when Carmine Fatico brought him in closer, putting him under the wing of Agnello Neil Della Croce, the Gambino underboss. Della Croce was a different breed, quiet, calculating, with the eyes of a man who'd buried more enemies than friends. He took a liking to Gotti's mix of charm and brutality. It was under Della Croce's guidance that Gotti learned the deeper rules of the life. Don't touch drugs, they bring heat. Never hit a man unless the boss says so. Always take care of your people, because they're the ones who will stand between you and a bullet. And most importantly, never, ever let the cops see you sweat. Through the early 70s, Gotti's crew ran hijackings, extortion rackets, and gambling dens. They had a system. The jobs were planned like military operations, and everyone got paid. Gotti started dressing sharper, talking smoother. He'd walk into a bar and buy drinks for everyone, not just to be generous, but to send a message: Johnny Boy's doing well. The women noticed. The men noticed more. It was around this time that Gotti committed one of his first sanctioned hits, a man who'd insulted Della Croce and refused to apologize. It wasn't personal, but in the life, disrespect was a debt that had to be paid in blood. Gotti didn't hesitate. He waited until the man was walking home from a card game, stepped out of the shadows, and pulled the trigger twice. Clean, quick, and cold. That night, he didn't sleep much. Not because he felt guilt, he didn't, but because something had shifted inside him. Killing wasn't just about pulling the trigger, it was about knowing when it was necessary. He understood now why men feared Della Croce. Fear was a weapon, and if used right, it could protect you better than any gun. By the mid-70s, Gotti was no longer just an earner. He was a rising star in the Gambino family. He had the loyalty of his crew, the trust of Della Croce, and the kind of ambition that kept him moving forward. But ambition cuts both ways. It gets you noticed by the right people and the wrong ones, and the wrong ones were starting to take notice. By the time the mid-1970s rolled around, John Gotti had become more than just Johnny Boy from the block. He was a man with a reputation, not just for making money, but for being the kind of guy who could get things done without hesitation. The word in Ozone Park was simple. If you needed muscle, if you needed a problem handled, you went to Gotti. And if you were smart, you stayed on his good side. Carmine Fatico, his early mentor, was stepping back from the street. Age, indictments, and the constant grind of mob life had worn him down. But the Gambino family didn't let good positions go to waste. Fatico's crew was valuable, especially with their stranglehold on the airport rackets, hijackings, and protection schemes. That's when the underboss, Neil Della Croce, made a decision that would change Gotti's life forever. He handed him the day-to-day control of the Bergen crew. It wasn't an official title yet. Gotti wasn't a captain, but he was the man in charge of the street work. Every hijacking, every shakedown, every gambling spot, they all reported to him now. And with that came a new kind of pressure. It wasn't enough to be feared. In this business, you had to deliver. Every week, envelopes needed to make their way up the ladder to Della Croce, and from Della Croce to the boss himself, Paul Castellano. Gotti knew Castellano, but they weren't cut from the same cloth. Castellano was the kind of boss who wanted to turn the family into a white-collar empire. Construction, unions, legitimate fronts. He wore tailored suits and thought of himself more as a CEO than a gangster. Gotti, on the other hand, loved the streets. He liked the direct action, the respect you could feel in a man's handshake when he knew you could have him buried before dinner. Even in those early years, there was an unspoken tension between Gotti's blue-collar gangster style and Castellano's boardroom approach. Under Gotti's control, the Bergen crew's operations flourished. The hijackings became more organized. Instead of hitting trucks at random, they had inside men in the Teamsters Union feeding them schedules and routes. They stole cargo without even needing to pull a gun. Sometimes the driver would just disappear for a few hours and the truck would turn up empty later. But hijackings were just one piece of the puzzle. Gotti also expanded the gambling operations, opening new spots in bars, basements, and back rooms across Queens. Bookies who refused to work with him found their cars burned or their bones broken. Those who cooperated got protection, not just from cops, but from rival crews. In a city crawling with sharks, Gotti made himself the biggest one in his waters. With power came enemies. Other crews in the family didn't like how quickly Gotti was rising. Some whispered that Della Croce was grooming him for bigger things. Others said Gotti was too reckless, too in love with the spotlight. And there was truth to that. Gotti wasn't the kind of guy to stay in the shadows. He dressed sharp, always in expensive suits and perfectly shined shoes. He carried himself like a man who already owned the streets, and he didn't mind letting people see it. That love of the spotlight could be dangerous. In 1973, Gotti got caught up in one of the most dangerous assignments of his early career, the hit on James McBratney. McBratney was a gangster who'd made a fatal mistake. He'd been involved in the kidnapping and killing of a Gambino-made man. In the mob, killing a made guy without permission was a death sentence. Castellano gave the order, and Della Croce tapped Gotti to handle it. The plan was simple. Lure McBratney to a bar in Staten Island under the pretense of a business meeting, then take him out quickly. Gotti went in with two other men, Ralph Gallione and Angelo Ruggiero. But nothing in the street ever goes perfectly. The job turned messy when McBratney fought back. Shots were fired, panic broke out, and before it was over, McBratney was dead on the floor, but witnesses had seen everything. The police came down hard. Gotti was arrested and charged with murder. It was the kind of case that could have ended his life right there, 30 years to life in a cell. But Gotti had something most men didn't, a lawyer who knew the system inside and out. Through a mix of intimidation of witnesses, jury selection games, and plea bargaining, Gotti managed to dodge the murder rap. He pled to attempted manslaughter and served only 4 years. Those 4 years changed him. Prison had been a classroom before, but this time it was something else. It was a networking event. He met heavy hitters from other families, learned more about the politics at the top, and cemented his reputation as a man who could take the heat without flipping. In the underworld, that was worth more than gold. When Gotti got out in 1977, Della Croce welcomed him back like a prodigal son. The Bergen crew was still his, but now he had more pull than ever. Castellano himself recognized Gotti's value, even if he didn't like his style. Castellano was practical. He knew Gotti brought in money, and in the mob, money talks louder than anything. But the streets were shifting. Drugs were flooding into New York, and though Castellano forbade his men from dealing them directly, plenty of crews were getting involved on the side. The profits were too big to ignore. Gotti's crew was no different. Officially, they stayed clear. Unofficially, they taxed dealers in their territory, provided muscle for drug shipments, and made sure nothing moved without their blessing. It was a dangerous game. If Castellano caught wind of it, heads would roll. But Gotti understood risk better than most. His personal life reflected the same contradictions. At home, he was a family man, married to his wife Victoria, with children he adored. In the neighborhood, he was the king of the block. He'd hand out cash to locals in need, pay for funerals, and sponsor community events. People who had nothing saw him as a savior. People who knew the truth understood he was also a predator. But in a place where everyone was struggling, the line between protector and exploiter was blurry. By the end of the 70s, Gotti was untouchable in Queens. The cops knew who he was. The FBI had him on their radar. Rivals hated him, but no one could take him down. He had Della Croce's protection, Castellano's reluctant approval, and a crew that would walk into hell for him. But the higher you climb, the steeper the drop. In 1980, tragedy struck Gotti's personal life. His 12-year-old son, Frank, was killed in a traffic accident when a neighbor, John Favara, accidentally struck him with his car. The police ruled it an accident, but grief in the Gotti household turned to rage. A few months later, Favara disappeared. His body was never found. The whispers on the street said it was Gotti's doing, that he'd ordered the hit, that it was personal, not business. If true, it was a breach of one of the mob's cardinal rules. Personal vendettas were dangerous, but no one said it to his face. The incident marked a shift in Gotti. He became colder, less patient, more willing to cross lines. And as the 80s began, his path would put him on a direct collision course with Castellano, a man who valued control above all else and who was starting to see Gotti's rising popularity as a threat. The stage was set. The streets were watching. And somewhere, deep down, Gotti knew that if he wanted the throne, he'd have to take it by force. The 1980s in New York were a strange kind of gold rush for the underworld. Money was flowing like water. Construction contracts, union payoffs, stock scams, and whether anyone admitted it or not, the booming drug trade. For the Gambino family, it was an era of massive profit, but also mounting pressure. The FBI wasn't the small-time nuisance it used to be. They were serious now, running wiretaps, flipping informants, and building cases designed to dismantle entire families at once. At the top of the Gambino sat Paul Castellano, Big Paul, a man who ruled more like a corporate chairman than a street boss. Castellano had an empire built on construction rackets, extortion, and influence over major unions. He loved fine dining, expensive suits, and his Staten Island mansion that looked more like a fortress than a home. To him, the mob was evolving away from street-level dirt and into white-collar sophistication. To John Gotti, it was the beginning of a slow death. Gotti respected the idea of making money, but the life, as he understood it, was about loyalty, strength, and reputation. Castellano's obsession with staying clean on paper made him look weak to the guys doing the real work. Worse, Big Paul had a personal rule that no one in the family could deal drugs. Officially, it was to keep law enforcement away. Unofficially, it was to keep the profits of the drug trade in the hands of those he trusted. For men like Gotti, this rule was a problem. His crew wasn't running cocaine directly, but they were taxing dealers, protecting shipments, and skimming off the top. It was enough to put him in violation of Castellano's orders if anyone decided to open their mouth. The tension between Gotti and Castellano wasn't open yet, but it was simmering, and Della Croce, the underboss and Gotti's mentor, was caught in the middle. Della Croce was old school, loyal to the boss, but fiercely protective of his people. He saw potential in Gotti, but knew Big Paul didn't trust him. Della Croce's advice was always the same: keep your head down, keep making money, and don't give Castellano a reason to come for you. For a while, Gotti played the game. The Bergen crew stayed busy, hijackings, loan sharking, gambling spots that never closed. The envelopes went up the ladder like clockwork. But in the shadows, Gotti's influence was spreading. Other captains respected him. The younger soldiers looked up to him. On the streets, he was already a bigger name than Castellano. Then came the White House meetings. Castellano had started holding gatherings at his mansion, calling captains in for long talks about keeping things low profile, cutting off risky operations, and focusing on legitimate ventures. Gotti hated those meetings. To him, they were a waste of time and a show of weakness. He'd sit there, stone-faced, listening to Castellano drone on about construction contracts and politicians, all the while thinking, this man doesn't understand the streets anymore. In 1983, Castellano's paranoia began to grow. The FBI had raided his home, installing cameras and bugs that caught him talking about family business. He started looking for traitors everywhere. When he caught wind of any crew suspected of drug activity, he'd order investigations, and sometimes hits, on his own men. Gotti knew the noose was tightening. The breaking point came in 1985. That year, the FBI arrested several members of the Gambino family, including Gotti's close friend and crew member Angelo Ruggiero, on heroin trafficking charges. The feds had recorded phone calls between Angelo and others in the crew discussing drug deals in detail. To make matters worse, those tapes also mentioned Gotti, carelessly, but enough to implicate him if Castellano ever heard them. When Castellano learned of the tapes, he demanded they be handed over to him. His plan was clear: listen to them, determine who'd broken the no-drug rule, and clean house. For Gotti, this was an execution order in disguise. If Castellano got those tapes, his days were numbered. Della Croce stepped in, trying to mediate. He told Castellano the tapes were family business and that they'd handle it internally. But the damage was done. Castellano's suspicion of Gotti turned into open distrust. Word began circulating that Big Paul was considering demoting or even whacking Gotti to send a message. And then, fate intervened. On December 2nd, 1985, Agnello Della Croce died of cancer. The funeral was packed with wise guys from every corner of the city. Gotti stood there, not just mourning his mentor, but calculating his next move. Della Croce had been the buffer between him and Castellano. With him gone, there was nothing standing in the way of Big Paul making his move. Within days, rumors started flying that Castellano was planning to restructure the family, possibly removing Gotti from his position. For Gotti, that wasn't just bad news. It was a death sentence. In the mob, losing your position often meant losing your life. Gotti's mind shifted from defense to offense. The plan began forming quietly, over late-night meetings at the Ravenite Social Club and whispered conversations in back rooms. Gotti and a small circle of loyalists, including Sammy the Bull Gravana and Frank DeChico, decided that the only way to survive was to take out Castellano. It wasn't just about staying alive anymore. It was about taking the throne. Killing a boss wasn't something you did lightly. It required the support, or at least the silence, of other powerful men in the family. Gotti started testing the waters, sounding out other captains. Some were cautious, but many were tired of Castellano's style. They didn't like his distance from the street, his obsession with his personal wealth, or the fact that he was openly breaking the mob's own rules for himself while holding everyone else to them. The green light wasn't official, but Gotti had enough nods to move forward. The opportunity came faster than expected. Castellano was scheduled to meet with his new underboss, Thomas Bellotti, at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan on December 16, 1985. Gotti knew if he could take them both out in one clean strike, the power vacuum would be his to fill before anyone could react. The plan was meticulous. Gotti wouldn't pull the trigger himself. He'd watch from a car nearby, making sure the job went down right. The shooters were picked for their nerves and accuracy. They'd be dressed like businessmen to blend into the crowd. The timing had to be perfect. Hit them as they stepped out of the car, make it quick, and disappear into the chaos of midtown traffic. As the day approached, Gotti kept his composure. Outwardly, he was business as usual, collecting envelopes, cracking jokes, keeping his crew in line. Inside, he was wound tight. One mistake, one hesitation, and he'd either be dead or in prison for life. December 16th was cold, the kind of winter day where your breath hangs in the air. Gotti sat in his car with Gravano, parked close enough to see Sparks's entrance. At 5:26 p.m., Castellano's Lincoln pulled up. Bellotti was driving, Castellano in the passenger seat. They stepped out into the gray evening light, Castellano's heavy coat buttoned tight against the wind. The shooters moved fast. Gunfire erupted, sharp and shocking against the hum of city traffic. Castellano went down instantly, bullets tearing through his head and chest. Bellotti barely had time to react before he was hit too, collapsing beside the car. It was over in seconds. Gotti watched without flinching. As soon as the shooters melted away into the crowd, he turned to Gravano and said, "Let's get out of here." The hit shocked the underworld and the law alike. Killing a sitting boss in public, in the middle of Manhattan, was almost unheard of. But within days, the message was clear. John Gotti was the new boss of the Gambino family. The captains gathered, and while some were uneasy, none dared challenge him. The streets whispered his name with a mix of awe and fear. The Dapper Don had arrived, but Gotti knew one thing that most of the city didn't yet understand. Taking the throne was the easy part. Keeping it would be the fight of his life. When Castellano's body hit the sidewalk outside Sparks, the entire underworld of New York went into a quiet panic. Everyone knew what had happened, even if no one was willing to say it out loud. In the mob, silence was its own kind of language. People didn't ask questions because they already knew the answers, and in this case, the answer was dangerous. In the days that followed, the Gambino family operated in a strange mix of fear and anticipation. Castellano had ruled like a CEO, distant and deliberate, but his death cracked the dam wide open. For some, it was a relief. Finally, someone who understood the street would be in charge. For others, it was a warning. If a sitting boss could be gunned down in Manhattan rush hour, nobody was untouchable. John Gotti moved fast. Power vacuums in this world didn't last. If you didn't fill it, someone else would, and they might fill it with bullets. He began calling captains into quiet meetings, shaking hands, locking eyes, making promises. He didn't come at them with threats or ultimatums. He offered stability. Under him, the money would keep flowing, the old rules would hold, and the streets would have their king again. It wasn't just business, it was personal. He was one of them. Frank DeChico was his right-hand man, a loyal operator who had been instrumental in pulling off the Castellano hit. Sammy Gravano, sharp and ruthless, was brought closer into the circle. These men became his inner guard. the ones who understood that loyalty wasn't just about friendship, it was about survival. Gotti made sure they were rewarded. Everyone in his crew got paid, and paid well. The rest of the family noticed. Within weeks, the captains held an official meeting. Gotti walked in wearing a tailored overcoat, the same confident stride he'd carried since his days at the Bergen crew, but now with the weight of the entire Gambino family behind him. There was no election. There didn't need to be. The nods around the table were enough. John Gotti was the new boss. The first order of business was consolidating power. Castellano had loyalists, men who didn't like Gotti's style, who preferred the quiet wealth of Big Paul's reign to the flash and noise they knew Gotti would bring. Gotti didn't purge them outright, but he watched them closely. Those who fell in line prospered. Those who didn't found themselves sidelined, their operations taken over by men Gotti trusted. But Gotti didn't just want control inside the family. He wanted control of the narrative outside it. He understood something Castellano never did. The media could be a weapon. To most mob bosses, newspapers and TV cameras were trouble. To Gotti, they were an opportunity. If the papers were going to write about him anyway, he might as well make sure they wrote the story he wanted told. That's how the public persona of the Dapper Don began to take shape. Gotti never left the house looking anything less than immaculate. $2,000 suits, silk ties, perfectly shined shoes. He smiled for photographers outside the Ravenite Social Club, as if the FBI agents across the street were paparazzi instead of enemies. When reporters shouted questions, he'd give them a wink or a sharp one-liner. The public loved it. Here was a gangster who wasn't hiding in the shadows. He walked into court like it was a red carpet event, flanked by his crew, chin high, grinning like a man who couldn't lose. For everyday New Yorkers struggling with crime, corruption, and a city on the brink, Gotti became a strange kind of folk hero, the man who stood up to the system and walked away smiling. Inside the life, not everyone admired the showmanship. Some thought he was drawing too much attention, making the family a bigger target for law enforcement. But Gotti didn't care. Respect in the street wasn't just about fear, it was about presence. When he walked into a room, people stopped talking. When he walked down Mulberry Street during a feast, the crowd parted like he was royalty. That kind of aura couldn't be bought. It had to be built. Money was flowing in faster than ever. The Gambino family's rackets in construction, garbage hauling, gambling, and loan sharking were thriving. Gotti wasn't afraid to get involved directly in deals. He'd meet with contractors, union bosses, and businessmen himself, making it clear that his handshake was as binding as any contract, and a lot more dangerous to break. Still, Gotti understood that being boss wasn't just about collecting envelopes. It was about enforcing discipline. He set the tone quickly. Disrespect would not be tolerated, from inside the family or out. When a loan shark tried to short the family on payments, Gotti had him beaten so badly he was in the hospital for weeks. When a captain started skimming too much off the top, his business was taken over by another crew overnight. The message was clear. This was Gotti's family now. The FBI's attention intensified almost immediately. They planted bugs in the Ravenite Social Club, tapped phones, and shadowed Gotti everywhere he went. But early on, Gotti seemed untouchable. Indictments came and went. Charges were filed and dropped. Witnesses disappeared, recanted, or couldn't remember enough to testify. In 1987, he faced a racketeering trial that could have put him away for decades. The evidence was strong, the prosecution confident. But when the verdict came back, it was not guilty on all counts. Outside the courthouse, Gotti emerged in a perfectly tailored suit, smiling as if he'd just closed a business deal. The press went wild. That was the day they gave him his second nickname, the Teflon Don, the man no charge could stick to. Inside, Gotti reveled in it. Each acquittal wasn't just a legal victory, it was a message to everyone watching. The cops couldn't touch him. The courts couldn't touch him. Even his enemies inside the mob had to admit that he had pulled off something rare. But the spotlight had its dangers. The Justice Department wasn't used to losing to mob bosses in public. Every acquittal made them more determined. Behind closed doors, FBI agents and federal prosecutors began building a new kind of case, not just against Gotti, but against the entire structure of the Gambino family. They weren't going to take him down for one crime. They were going to try to dismantle his empire. Meanwhile, inside the family, cracks were beginning to show. Gotti's high-profile style meant more heat for everyone, and not every captain appreciated it. Some whispered that he was risking too much, that the days of the untouchable mob boss were over. Others envied his fame, wondering if they might do better in the chair themselves. Gotti wasn't blind to it. He kept his friends close, his enemies closer, and his soldiers well-fed. He spent more time at the Ravenite than he did at home, holding court, keeping the pulse of the street. He knew the life was a constant balancing act: money, fear, loyalty, and timing. For now, he had all of them. But in the back of his mind, he knew that in this world, the fall could come as quickly as the rise. And the higher he stood, the harder the landing would be. By the late 1980s, the glow of John Gotti's public image was burning hotter than ever. But so was the heat from law enforcement. Every week, there seemed to be a new headline, a fresh photograph of him walking into or out of a courthouse, another smiling snapshot on the front page of the New York Post. The media treated him like a celebrity, but the FBI wasn't applauding. They were digging in deeper, building a case designed not to bruise him, but to end him. The Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy had become Gotti's throne room. Day and night, wise guys streamed in and out. Captains, soldiers, and associates came to kiss the ring, drop envelopes, or just get their marching orders. To the outside world, it looked like a parade of loyalty. To the FBI, it was a goldmine of surveillance. Agents set up shop in vans parked across the street, cameras pointed at the front door. Every face that went in was photographed, every license plate recorded. But it wasn't enough to see who came and went. They needed to hear what was being said. That's when the bugging began. The feds knew Gotti was careful in public. He didn't talk about murders or drug deals where strangers could hear. But the Ravenite had a back room, a small, dim space where Gotti would meet privately with his closest men. If the FBI could get a microphone in there, they might catch something real. In 1989, they made their move. One night, while the club was empty, a specialized FBI team broke in. They knew exactly where they wanted to plant the device, hiding it inside a light fixture where it would be nearly impossible to spot. Within days, they were listening to Gotti's private conversations. What they heard wasn't a smoking gun, not yet. Gotti still spoke in the coded language of the streets, but he was confident, maybe too confident. He named names. He talked about disputes, about who was earning and who wasn't. And he did something that made agents' ears perk up. He criticized men in his own inner circle. That inner circle was already under stress. Frank DeCicco, Gotti's trusted underboss, had been killed in 1986 in a car bombing meant for Gotti himself. The hit had been ordered by Vincent Chin Gigante, the boss of the Genovese family, as payback for Castellano's murder. The loss of DeCicco had cut deep. Gotti replaced him with Joseph Joe Piney Armoni, an old-timer, but it wasn't the same. Frank had been family in every way that mattered. Without him, cracks began to appear in Gotti's foundation. One of the men who stepped closer into Gotti's confidence was Sammy the Bull Gravano. Sammy was a different breed, ruthless, sharp, and ambitious, with a reputation for making problems disappear. He was also a big earner, and in Gotti's world, that meant value. Over time, Gotti began relying on him more, giving him more authority, and eventually making him underboss. For a while, the partnership worked. Sammy handled business quietly while Gotti handled the image. But the very thing that made Gotti a legend in the papers made life harder for his captains. The FBI and NYPD were always around. Surveillance was constant. Crews had to work harder to keep heat off their operations. The Ravenite bug kept rolling, capturing pieces of conversations, some mundane, some damning. Gotti's voice was on tape ordering beatings, discussing money, and venting about certain captains. He'd call some of them lazy, others stupid, and those words, harmless in the moment, would later come back to haunt him. In the mob, loyalty was sacred, but so was respect. Men who felt insulted didn't forget it. Meanwhile, the Justice Department was changing its approach. Instead of hitting mobsters with individual charges, they were using the RICO Act, an aggressive federal law that allowed prosecutors to treat an entire organization as a criminal enterprise. Under RICO, a boss could be convicted for crimes committed by his soldiers if prosecutors could prove he ordered or benefited from them. For Gotti, that meant he didn't have to be caught pulling a trigger. He just had to be caught talking. The FBI's big break came when they bugged the apartment above the Ravenite. It belonged to the elderly widow of a Gambino member, and Gotti liked to use it for more private meetings than the club's back room. The feds got in, planted their devices, and hit the jackpot. On those tapes, Gotti was less guarded. He spoke about murders in enough detail to link himself to them. He complained about his captains not following orders. He talked about how certain men had to go. Even in coded language, the meaning was clear. The agents were ecstatic. Prosecutors began building a new indictment, one that wouldn't just charge Gotti with racketeering, but would tie him directly to multiple murders, including those of Castellano, Bellotti, and other Gambino rivals. Back on the street, the mood was shifting. Gotti was still the Dapper Don in the public eye, still the man who could walk out of court grinning. But inside the family, there was unease. Sammy Gravano had noticed something. Gotti liked to talk. He liked to tell stories, to make himself the center of every narrative. And the more he talked, the more he gave the feds to work with. By 1990, the FBI was ready. On December 11th, agents surrounded the Ravenite. Gotti, Gravano, and consigliere Frank Locascio were arrested in one sweep. The indictment was massive: racketeering, murder, loan sharking, illegal gambling. It was the kind of case that could bury them for life. Gotti walked out in cuffs with the same calm swagger he always had, but there was a flicker in his eyes that hadn't been there before. This case wasn't like the others. The evidence was different. It wasn't about unreliable witnesses. It was about his own voice on tape. In prison awaiting trial, Gotti's world shrank to the size of a cell. The media still called him the Teflon Don, but in the bullpen, he could feel the walls closing in. He started strategizing, leaning on Gravano to coordinate things on the outside. Sammy visited him often, bringing updates, reassuring him that the family was holding together. But those tapes, they haunted every conversation with his lawyers. The defense could argue interpretation, but there was no denying it was Gotti's voice. And in some of those recordings, he'd been less than flattering about the very man now sitting across from him in the visiting room, Sammy the Bull. It was a small thing, just words, but in the life, words could kill faster than bullets. Sammy heard those tapes during trial prep. He heard Gotti call him greedy, question some of his moves, and hint at taking him down a notch. For a man who'd killed for loyalty, that cut deep. The seeds of betrayal were planted right there, in the sterile hum of the prison visiting room, under the cold watch of federal guards. By the time the trial date approached in 1991, the name Teflon Don was more of a challenge for the FBI than a nickname. The government had been humiliated before when Gotti beat their cases, and they were not going to let it happen again. This time, they had the kind of evidence prosecutors dream about: hours of secret recordings of John Gotti himself, talking business in the Ravenite apartment and back rooms, his voice calmly giving orders, making judgments on who should live and who shouldn't. The indictment was built like a fortress. Racketeering, 5 murders, conspiracy to commit murder, loan sharking, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice. It was a sweeping case designed to erase Gotti from the streets permanently. And it wasn't just him. His underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, and consigliere Frank Locascio were also on trial. If the government could convict all 3, it would decapitate the Gambino family in one blow. Inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center, Gotti tried to keep his composure. Outwardly, he played the same role he always had: the confident boss, unfazed, still cracking jokes, still walking into the courtroom in tailored suits that seemed more suited for a wedding than a murder trial. The press loved it. The public ate it up. But behind the scenes, in whispered meetings with his defense team, the mood was different. The tapes were a problem. A big one. No matter how careful the defense was, no matter how many alternate interpretations they could suggest, It was still Gotti's voice, talking about people going to the doctor or getting straightened out. Mob euphemisms everyone in the courtroom knew meant murder. Even worse, some of the comments were aimed squarely at his own underboss. Sammy Gravano had been loyal, no question about it. He'd taken care of business for Gotti, made money for the family, and handled disputes with a ruthlessness that kept their rackets running smooth. But Gravano was also a man with pride, and when he heard those recordings for the first time, something changed. It happened in a meeting with the lawyers when the defense team played back one of the FBI's key tapes. On it, Gotti could be heard saying Gravano was too greedy, that he was drawing too much attention, and that maybe he'd have to be put in his place. Gotti said it casually, almost offhand, but to Sammy, it was like a knife between the ribs. He didn't show it right away. He sat there, stone-faced, nodding, pretending it didn't bother him. But later, in the solitude of his cell, it festered. This was a man he'd killed for, a man he'd protected, a man whose orders he'd followed without hesitation. And here he was, talking about him like a liability. The prosecutors saw their opening. Assistant U.S. Attorney John Gleason and FBI agents began quietly feeling Sammy out. They didn't approach him directly at first. They let the situation marinate. They knew pressure could crack even the toughest men, and in the life, betrayal didn't always come from weakness, it came from survival. As the trial began, the government's case was strong but not invincible. The defense attacked the credibility of the surveillance, questioned the FBI's methods, and painted Gotti as a victim of overzealous prosecutors who'd been chasing him for years. Jurors saw a man who was almost charismatic enough to believe. Almost. Then came the whispers. Sammy was thinking about flipping. At first, Gotti dismissed it. The bull? Nah, he told Locascio during a private meeting. He ain't that kind of guy. He's solid. But as the weeks went on, the behavior changed. Sammy became quieter, more withdrawn. He skipped certain conversations, stayed away from strategy talks. In late 1991, Gravano made the move that would rewrite mob history. In a closed-door meeting with prosecutors, he agreed to cooperate. The deal was unprecedented. Sammy would testify against Gotti in exchange for a reduced sentence, entering the witness protection program afterward. The man who'd been Gotti's enforcer was now going to be the government's star witness. When Gotti found out, it hit like a sucker punch. There was disbelief, then anger, then a cold realization that the game had changed. Gravano didn't just know about some of the crimes, he knew about all of them. He'd been in the room for the Castellano hit planning. He'd been part of murder discussions, drug taxes, extortion rackets. If Sammy talked, the Teflon coating would peel right off. The prosecutors wasted no time putting him on the stand. Gravano's testimony was devastating. Calm, detailed, and unflinching, he walked the jury through the inner workings of the Gambino family. He described meetings, orders, the chain of command. He named names, dates, and places. When he spoke about the Castellano hit, he laid it out like a business transaction, how Gotti had decided the boss had to go, how they'd set up the Sparks Steakhouse ambush, and how it had all gone down in seconds. The defense tried to discredit him, painting him as a liar and a killer trying to save his own skin. It was true, Sammy admitted to 19 murders, but the jury seemed to believe him when he said, "I'm not proud of it, but I did it. And I did it for him," pointing at Gotti. As the trial dragged on, the atmosphere around Gotti changed. The smiles for the cameras were still there, but they looked tighter now, the jokes more forced. The courtroom that had once felt like his stage now felt like a cage. Each day, more evidence piled up, tapes, testimony, financial records, all pointing in one direction. The jury didn't take long. On April 2nd, 1992, they delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts. 5 murders, racketeering, conspiracy, the works. It was a clean sweep for the government. The Teflon Don was Teflon no more. When the sentence came down, it was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent except for the judge's voice. Gotti sat there, still wearing his trademark suit, still holding himself upright, but there was no mistaking the weight of it. This was the end of the street for him. Outside, the reaction was split. Some celebrated the fall of a man they saw as a criminal kingpin who'd thumbed his nose at the law for too long. Others mourned the loss of the swaggering folk hero who'd walked out of court so many times before. Inside the mob, the message was clear. If Gotti could be taken down, anyone could. Gravano, for his part, disappeared into the witness protection program, his deal giving him a mere 5-year sentence despite his body count. In the life, his name became synonymous with betrayal. For Gotti, it was the ultimate insult that his own underboss, the man he'd trusted above all others after Della Croce, had been the one to put the final nail in his coffin. Back in his cell, Gotti adjusted to the reality of a life behind bars. No more tailored suits, no more Ravenite social club, no more late-night strategy sessions. The world outside would keep spinning, the family would keep earning, but he'd be watching it from behind steel and concrete for the rest of his days. The first night in Marion Penitentiary was the kind of quiet that could crush a man's chest. No traffic noise, no street talk, no Ravenite chatter, just the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint echo of boots in the corridor. For a man like John Gotti, who had spent his life commanding the flow of people and business in a city that never slept, it felt like being dropped onto another planet. The government didn't send him to Marion by accident. This wasn't just prison. It was the highest security facility in the federal system at the time. They wanted him cut off, isolated, unable to keep the Gambino family together from behind bars the way some bosses had before. The feds knew Gotti's reputation. They knew he had the charisma to keep giving orders, and they weren't about to let him turn a cell block into a Ravenite. Still, you don't cage a man like Gotti and expect him to stop being who he is. Even in the most controlled environment, he started carving out influence. Marion was filled with the worst of the worst. Murderers, terrorists, lifers with nothing to lose. And yet, the moment Gotti arrived, inmates sized him up not as another convict, but as the John Gotti. Some came up out of respect, others came out of curiosity, a few out of the stupid kind of bravado that gets a man hurt in the yard. Gotti handled them the way he always did, calm, direct, unflinching. If you were respectful, he treated you with dignity. If you stepped wrong, he made sure you understood you'd made a mistake. Within months, he had a small network of loyal inmates, Italian, Irish, even a few black and Hispanic cons who respected power no matter the flag it flew under. They weren't soldiers in the Gambino sense. They looked out for him, moved messages when needed, and made his life inside easier. The staff noticed. Marion's administration didn't want a boss running the joint, so they kept him in near constant lockdown. 23 hours a day in a cell the size of a bathroom, with 1 hour for exercise in a cage barely big enough to pace in. It was psychological warfare as much as physical, but Gotti was stubborn. If they wanted to break him, they'd have to bury him first. From the very start, Gotti found ways to keep a hand on the outside world. Visitors were limited, conversations monitored, but mob families had been playing cat and mouse with the Bureau of Prisons for decades. He used coded language, gestures, and trusted intermediaries to keep communication flowing to the street. His son, John A. Jr. Gotti, was stepping into a bigger role in the family during these years. Jr. would visit, listen to his father's instructions, and carry them back to New York. Other trusted captains, like Peter Gotti, acted as his eyes and ears. On the surface, the Gambinos kept functioning. Rackets were still running, envelopes still being passed. But the truth was, without Gotti physically present, the cracks were widening. Inside Marion, Gotti had another battle, his health. Years of smoking, stress, and hard living began to take a toll. By the mid-1990s, he started experiencing severe stomach pain. At first, he brushed it off. Pride wouldn't let him show weakness, but prison doctors diagnosed throat cancer in 1998. It was a gut punch, even for a man who'd stared down the death penalty in court. They moved him to the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. It wasn't freedom, far from it, but it was a different kind of cage, more light, more space, and the company of other high-profile inmates wasting away from illness. Gotti didn't complain. He still dressed sharp when he could, still carried himself like the boss. But the cancer was relentless. The outside world hadn't forgotten him. His name still sold newspapers, and every time there was a story about the mob, someone mentioned the Dapper Don. In New York, old-timers still told stories about him walking Mulberry Street like a king, and young wannabes still dreamed of wearing his shoes. But in reality, the life was changing. Law enforcement was dismantling the old structure piece by piece. The days when a boss could sit in a club all night without fear were over. Gotti followed it all from inside. Junior's arrests, the indictments against captains he'd once trusted, the slow bleed of influence as rivals and law enforcement carved away at the Gambino empire. He gave advice when he could, but there was a growing sense that the world outside was no longer his to command. Still, even with his body failing, his pride never did. In prison, he refused to be submissive. When guards disrespected him, he let them know he wasn't afraid. Once, when an inmate made the mistake of mouthing off, Gotti, already weakened by cancer, threw a punch just to make a point. "I might die in here," he told another inmate later, "but I ain't dying on my knees." By 2001, his condition had deteriorated badly. Surgery, radiation, and treatment had left him gaunt, his once thick hair thinned, his voice gravelly. Yet even in his last months, he was still John Gotti, still demanding, still sharp when the painkillers allowed, still every inch the man who had taken out Castellano and walked into the Ravenite like he owned New York. On June 10th, 2002, John Gotti died in prison at the age of 61. The official cause was complications from cancer, but in truth, the government had done what no rival could, kept him in a box until his body gave out. Back in New York, the wake and funeral were as close to a spectacle as the family could make it under heavy law enforcement scrutiny. Hundreds came to pay respects, wise guys, neighborhood locals, and old associates who hadn't seen him in years. The coffin was polished, the flowers elaborate, the air thick with the kind of unspoken grief that comes when a man who seemed unbreakable is finally gone. To some, Gotti was a ruthless killer who brought too much heat to the mob. To others, he was the last of a dying breed, a street boss who lived and died by the rules of his world, who never hid, never bent the knee, and never spoke a word to law enforcement. Even in death, the arguments about his legacy would rage on. But for the men who had known him on the street, the ones who'd sat across from him in smoke-filled rooms, one thing was certain: there would never be another quite like the Dapper Don. When the news broke on June 10th, 2002, that John Gotti had died in prison, New York's underworld froze for a moment. No matter what people thought of him, admiration, hatred, or a mix of both, everyone understood it was the end of an era. Gotti had been more than a mob boss. He'd been a symbol. To law enforcement, he was the most high-profile gangster in modern memory. To the streets, he was the last man to wear the crown with swagger, not from behind a boardroom desk like Castellano, but out in public, in the neighborhoods where the life still meant something. The official cause was complications from throat cancer, but for the Gambino family, the reality was harsher. Their leader had been taken out of the game not by a rival's bullet, but by the slow grind of the federal prison system. They hadn't lost him in a blaze of gunfire. They'd lost him in a hospital bed, far from the streets he ruled. In Howard Beach, the Gotti family prepared for the wake. The house filled with relatives, old friends, and loyalists who had managed to avoid indictments. There was a tension in the air, half grief, half the cold awareness that without Gotti, the family's internal politics were about to get complicated. The FBI knew this too. In the days leading up to the funeral, surveillance was everywhere. Agents watched the house, followed known Gambino members, took note of who came to pay respects. To them, it was more than a farewell. It was a roll call of the current power players. The funeral itself was deliberately low-key compared to the lavish spectacles of the old days. Heavy law enforcement presence made sure of that. Gone were the endless rows of limousines, the huge floral arrangements spelling out titles like Boss or Our Don. Still, hundreds turned out. Old-timers from the neighborhood stood shoulder to shoulder with men in suits whose faces were known only to the streets. Some were there to honor him, some were there out of obligation, and some came just to see the end for themselves, to be able to say they'd been there when they buried the last of the public dons. Inside the family, the question of succession had already been answered in theory. Peter Gotti, John's older brother, had been acting boss during his imprisonment. But Peter lacked the charisma, the fear, and the sheer presence that had made John larger than life. He was competent enough to keep the structure from collapsing outright, but he didn't inspire the same loyalty or command the same respect. Worse, law enforcement had already set their sights on Peter. Within a year of John's death, Peter would be indicted on racketeering charges, accused of running the family from behind bars, just as his brother had tried to do. The Gambinos were looking at a leadership vacuum, and in the life, that was an invitation for trouble. The old hierarchy began to shift. Some captains tried to consolidate power in their own territories. Others quietly distanced themselves from the Gotti name, calculating that the heat it drew was more trouble than it was worth. Younger members who had grown up hearing stories about the Dapper Don found themselves navigating a new reality, one where the FBI's war on organized crime was more aggressive than ever, and the old ways of operating openly on the street were almost impossible. On the streets of Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island, people still talked about Gotti like he was a myth. In barbershops, over espresso in small cafes, men would lean in and say, "Johnny Boy never hid from nobody." They'd tell the same stories over and over, how he'd walk through Little Italy during the San Gennaro feast like a king, how he'd laugh in the face of indictments, how he'd never let a cop see him sweat. But beneath the nostalgia was a harder truth. Gotti's style, the flash and the headlines, had brought heat that hurt the family long after he was gone. Other bosses in the commission, men like Vincent Chin Gigante of the Genovese family, had managed to avoid the kind of media circus Gotti embraced. They operated quietly, made money, and kept law enforcement at bay for decades. Gotti's reign had been shorter and more turbulent, and the damage from the constant spotlight was still being felt. Law enforcement didn't slow down after his death. If anything, they pushed harder. In the early 2000s, federal prosecutors rolled out more RICO cases, targeting not just bosses and captains, but soldiers and associates. Informants, inspired by the massive sentence reduction Sammy Gravano had gotten for flipping, began cooperating in greater numbers. Every trial seemed to have a new witness willing to spill decades of secrets for a shot at freedom. The Gambino family, once the most powerful of New York's 5 families, found itself weakened. It wasn't broken, rackets still ran, money still flowed, but the iron grip that Gotti had once held was gone. Control became more fragmented, alliances shifted faster, trust became harder to come by. In the years following his death, the Gotti name stayed in the headlines, but not always for reasons that honored the old boss. Junior Gotti faced multiple trials for racketeering and other charges, each ending in mistrials or acquittals. His defense painted him as a man who had left the life behind, though prosecutors accused him of still being involved. Whether he had truly walked away or not, his courtroom battles kept the Gotti name alive in the press, a reminder of the family's lingering notoriety. Pop culture didn't forget either. Books, documentaries, and TV specials dissected Gotti's rise and fall. Some painted him as a ruthless killer, others romanticized him as the last real gangster. The truth was somewhere in between, a man who lived by the rules of a violent world, but who also understood the value of image and spectacle in a way few mobsters ever had. In Howard Beach, his old neighborhood, you could still find people who spoke of him with respect. They'd remember the cash he'd hand out at Christmas, the way he'd make sure the widows of fallen men were taken care of, the sense of order he brought to the streets. To them, he wasn't a headline or a criminal. He was the guy who made sure their block was safe, who kept certain problems from reaching their doorsteps. And yet, among the younger generation of mobsters, Gotti was more cautionary tale than inspiration. They saw the glare of the cameras, the endless trials, the betrayals, and the decades lost behind bars. They understood that in the modern world, a gangster who made himself a celebrity was only building a bigger target on his back. For the FBI, the death of John Gotti was the closing of a chapter, but not the end of the book. His reign had been the most public, the most glamorous, and in some ways the most destructive in modern mob history. Taking him down had been their biggest trophy, and they weren't about to stop hunting the rest of the rackets he'd once controlled. In the years that followed, the Gambino family would survive, but it would never again be quite the same. The days of walking openly in the neighborhood as an untouchable king were over. The Ravenite Social Club was gone, shut down after the FBI raids. The feast processions in Little Italy were quieter. The younger bosses who came after operated from the shadows, determined not to make the same mistakes. John Gotti's grave in St. John's Cemetery became a kind of pilgrimage site for those who still believed in the legend. Flowers appeared regularly, sometimes from family, sometimes from strangers who'd never met him, but felt they knew him through the stories. The polished granite bore his name without titles. No boss, no Dapper Don, just John Gotti, 1940 to 2002. It was a reminder that no matter how high a man rises in that world, the ending is always the same, a hole in the ground, and whatever memories people choose to keep alive. For some, he'd always be the last great street boss. For others, he'd be the man who brought too much light to a world that can only survive in the dark. And for the Gambino family, he'd be both, a legend and a warning, the man who showed them the heights of power and the cost of living there. Peter Gotti had never been groomed to be boss. When John Gotti was at the height of his power, Peter was the quiet brother in the background, working in sanitation before drifting into the family's rackets. He didn't have John's charisma or his taste for the spotlight, and he certainly didn't have the same street presence. But when the Dapper Don was locked up for life in 1992, there weren't many trusted hands left who could keep the Gambino machine running without immediately sparking a civil war. By the late 90s, Peter had been acting boss for years, taking instructions from John through coded messages and intermediaries. In practice, he was more caretaker than ruler, holding the family together while his younger brother remained the true power from behind bars. But by 2002, with John's death, the arrangement became permanent. Peter Gotti was now officially head of the Gambino family. It was a crown that weighed heavy on his head. From the start, the FBI saw Peter as an easier target than his brother. John had been slippery, a master of courtroom theater, and a man whose personal magnetism could sway juries. Peter was none of those things. He was pragmatic, cautious, and lacked the flair to turn trials into performances. To law enforcement, that made him vulnerable. To the street, it made him less inspiring. The family under Peter's leadership was already weakened. The Castellano hit had fractured alliances years earlier, and John's flashy reign brought unprecedented law enforcement heat that still hadn't cooled. RICO cases had gutted the ranks, and the steady drip of informants, emboldened by the sweetheart deal Sammy Gravano had gotten, was eating away at the old code of silence. Peter's immediate challenge was keeping the Gambinos from splintering. The captains who had survived the Gotti years had their own interests to protect. And without a boss who could command fear and respect in equal measure, they were more inclined to operate independently. Some saw Peter as a placeholder, a man keeping the seat warm until someone with more clout came along. Others saw him as a man who could be manipulated. The truth was somewhere in between. Peter wasn't weak, but he wasn't built for bold moves either. He preferred to maintain the family's existing rackets, construction payoffs, garbage hauling, loan sharking, and gambling, rather than expand into new territory. He avoided unnecessary violence, knowing every act of brutality gave the FBI another reason to tighten the noose. But in a business where power is proven through action, that caution read as hesitation. The FBI didn't give him long to breathe. Within months of John's funeral, they were building a case against Peter for racketeering and money laundering. The charges centered on his involvement in union corruption schemes, particularly the waterfront rackets and the International Longshoremen's Association. The government claimed Peter and other Gambino members were extorting businesses and manipulating contracts, using the same tactics the family had relied on for decades. In 2003, Peter Gotti was arrested and charged with multiple counts of racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy to kill Sammy Gravano. The Gravano plot was a reminder that, even weakened, the family still operated by certain principles. Betrayal was supposed to carry a price. But the fact that the feds had gotten enough evidence to indict the boss for a murder conspiracy showed just how much the walls were closing in. The trial was ugly. Prosecutors paraded witnesses who detailed Gambino rackets in painstaking detail, painting Peter not as a criminal mastermind, but as the head of a crumbling empire still clinging to its old revenue streams. The jury didn't take long. Peter was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. His downfall left the family in limbo. Leadership fell into the hands of an unofficial panel of senior captains, but without a single dominant figure to unify them, decision-making became fractured. Some captains preferred to run their crews quietly and avoid law enforcement attention. Others pushed for expansion, especially into drug trafficking, despite the old taboo that had brought so much trouble in Gotti's time. Meanwhile, the FBI kept the pressure on. The early 2000s saw wave after wave of indictments against the Gambinos. Federal prosecutors went after every level of the family, from high-ranking captains down to soldiers and associates. The goal wasn't just to take down the boss, it was to grind the entire organization into dust. It wasn't just the feds. Rival families, sensing weakness, began muscling in on Gambino territory. The Genovese and Lucchese families made quiet moves into construction rackets the Gambinos had once dominated. Street-level disputes flared in Queens and Brooklyn, testing the Gambino crew's ability to defend their turf. Without the fearsome aura John had maintained, or the iron hand Castellano had used before him, holding ground became harder. On top of that, the old neighborhoods were changing. Gentrification pushed out the tight-knit Italian-American communities that had once been the family's backbone. New immigrants brought their own criminal networks, less tied to the traditions of the commission and more willing to fight dirty without any regard for mob rules. By the mid-2000s, the Gambino family was still active, but its dominance was gone. Law enforcement surveillance was relentless. Every meeting risked being recorded. Every conversation could end up in a courtroom. The very structure of the mafia, designed for secrecy, was being dismantled from the inside by informants and flipped soldiers. Peter Gotti's incarceration marked a shift from the old way of doing things. There would be no more bosses walking openly through their neighborhoods, shaking hands with locals and smiling for cameras. The men who came after operated from the shadows, often unknown even to many of their own soldiers. Public visibility was no longer an asset. It was a death sentence. In 2008, another massive FBI sweep, Operation Old Bridge, took down over 60 Gambino members and associates, including high-ranking captains. It was a coordinated strike that hit the family on both sides of the Atlantic, with arrests in New York and Italy. The charges ranged from murder to drug trafficking to extortion. For the Gambinos, it was another blow that made rebuilding even harder. Peter Gotti would remain in prison for the rest of his life. He filed multiple requests for compassionate release in his later years, citing failing health and blindness from glaucoma, but the government denied them. In February 2021, Peter died behind bars at the age of 81. His death was quieter than his brother's. No headlines, no crowds, no grand funeral under the watch of FBI cameras. Just another old man who lived and died in the life, ending his days in federal custody. For the Gambino family, the post-Peter years were defined by survival, not dominance. They adapted, shifting towards smaller, more discreet rackets, relying on low-profile leadership and tighter operational security. They still had influence in unions, construction, and gambling, but the days of the public Don were over. John's shadow still loomed. His reign had shown both the power and the peril of charisma in the mob. Peter's quieter rule showed the limits of running the family without it. Between the two, the Gambinos had learned a costly lesson. Visibility brought heat, but invisibility brought instability. In the modern underworld, the sweet spot was somewhere in between, a balance few could master. By the end of the 2010s, the Gambino family was still standing, but it was no longer the juggernaut it had been in the Gotti years. Law enforcement had taken too much. The old neighborhoods had changed, and the world itself had moved on. The commission was a shadow of its former self, and the golden era of New York's mafia where names like Gotti could dominate headlines for years, was firmly in the past. The throne still existed, but it wasn't the one John or Peter had sat on. It was smaller, quieter, and hidden in the dark. By the 2010s, the Gambino family was a ghost of the empire it had been during John Gotti's reign, but it wasn't dead. Far from it. The headlines no longer screamed their name. The Ravenite was long gone, and the days of a boss strolling through the neighborhood with cameras snapping were over. But beneath the surface, in quieter bars, back rooms, and construction offices, the Gambinos were still in business. The leadership after Peter Gotti's death sentence didn't crown itself in public. Whoever wore the crown did it in the shadows, without press conferences in courtrooms or walking out of indictments in $1,000 suits. This was the modern mob, low-key, compartmentalized, and designed to avoid the kind of heat that had burned John Gotti alive in the 80s and 90s. The men at the top had learned from his downfall. The structure remained familiar. The boss and underboss, a consigliere, captains running crews, soldiers under them, and associates doing the grunt work. But communication was different. Meetings were smaller, often in motion, walks in the park, chance encounters at gas stations, and car rides with the radio turned up loud to block any possible surveillance. Technology had changed the game for law enforcement, and the family adapted. Gone were the days when the FBI needed to bug a backroom and wait weeks for something useful. Now, with cell towers, metadata, and constant digital tracking, one careless phone call could bury a man. For the Gambinos, that meant face-to-face business was the only real business. They kept their hands in old rackets, construction kickbacks, union manipulation, gambling operations both physical and online, and loan sharking. But there was also a shift toward newer opportunities. Cybercrime wasn't their specialty, but they were smart enough to partner with groups who knew it well, taking a cut without getting their hands dirty. The ports were still valuable, especially in New Jersey and Staten Island. Containers came in from overseas, and with the right dock worker or union rep in your pocket, merchandise could vanish before customs ever laid eyes on it. Electronics, clothing, untaxed cigarettes, they all still made money, though nowhere near the windfall hijackings of the 1970s airport days. One major change was the role of drugs. Officially, the Gambinos still avoided large-scale narcotics trafficking, a holdover from Castellanos' strict rules. Unofficially, they taxed dealers, offered protection, and occasionally moved product through trusted intermediaries. But they stayed far from the direct, sloppy involvement that had doomed so many other crews. The biggest advantage they had now was that law enforcement was spread thin. The FBI wasn't the same agency that had dedicated entire squads to taking down the 5 families. Terrorism, cybercrime, and white-collar fraud had pulled resources away from organized crime. The mob was no longer the #1 target it had been in the Ryko-fueled glory days of the 1980s. That gave the Gambinos breathing room, if they stayed disciplined. And discipline was the key word. The new bosses enforced a no-headlines policy. No flashy suits, no media appearances, no public feuds. If you got indicted, you kept your mouth shut and did your time without fanfare. If you couldn't handle that, you weren't trusted with serious work. The Gotti name was still currency in some circles, but inside the family, it was both an asset and a liability. Younger members admired John's fearlessness, but the older generation remembered the heat it brought. Some captains would drop the Gotti name to intimidate outsiders, while others quietly told their crews to avoid any association. The legacy was complicated. It inspired loyalty, but it also carried the stink of 100 FBI cases. Outside the life, the Gotti brand had turned into something else entirely. Reality TV, tell-all books, and tabloid interviews had made the name familiar to people who had never heard of the Gambino family in its prime. Some of John's relatives embraced the spotlight, while others stayed far from it. For the modern Gambinos trying to rebuild quietly, the celebrity aspect was an annoyance. They didn't need curious reporters sniffing around looking for the new Gotti. What they needed was control, and control in the 21st century meant blending in. The younger soldiers didn't swagger down the street in custom suits. They dressed like construction foremen, warehouse supervisors, or middle managers. They drove ordinary cars. They lived in homes that didn't scream money. The goal was to make it so that if an FBI agent looked at them, there was nothing that screamed mobster. The money was different too. In Gotti's day, there were big scores, airport hijackings, multi-million-dollar union deals. Now, the income was steadier, smaller, and spread across more ventures. Crews would have 10 or 15 low-risk operations running at once. Sports betting rings, stolen goods, no-show union jobs, cash businesses that laundered money from other rackets. Violence still had its place, but it was more strategic. Gone were the days of public hits like Sparks Steakhouse. Murders, when they happened, were quiet and untraceable. More often, discipline came in the form of intimidation, beatings, property damage, financial ruin. You didn't make the evening news if you could help it. Gambino's influence overseas remained, especially in Sicily. Old alliances with Italian clans were still alive, and cooperation on smuggling operations went both ways. But even here, the tone was different. Partnerships were business arrangements, not the grand gestures of loyalty they once had been. Everyone knew law enforcement was watching across borders now too. The FBI still scored hits. Every few years, a big operation would bring down a chunk of the family, usually on charges of extortion or labor racketeering. But unlike in the Gotti years, these busts didn't take out the entire top layer of leadership. The family had learned to insulate the boss so well that prosecutors often struggled to prove he even existed. In the neighborhoods, the Gambino's presence was quieter, but still felt. They didn't need to run every block. They just needed people to know they could show up if necessary. Disputes between locals, debts, or trouble with outside gangs often found their way to someone with Gambino connections. They'd mediate, take their cut, and disappear back into the background. The modern Gambinos were less like kings and more like landlords. You might not see them, but you paid them all the same. By the mid to late 2010s, this low-profile strategy was paying off. Law enforcement still kept them on the radar, but without constant headlines, they avoided the all-out wars with prosecutors that had destroyed them in the past. Quiet stability meant steady money, and steady money meant loyalty. But there was always the risk of slipping back into old habits. In 2019, the murder of reputed Gambino captain Francesco "Frankie Boy" Cali outside his Staten Island home shocked the city. It was the first public hit on a high-ranking mobster in decades. At first, it looked like the old days were back. People whispered about power struggles, revenge, and underworld politics. But when the killer turned out to be an unstable outsider with no real mob ties, the fears of a bloody internal war faded. Still, the incident was a reminder. The mob was never completely in the shadows. All it took was one act of violence, one careless move to drag the spotlight back. For the Gambinos, the future was about balance. They couldn't disappear entirely. Power required presence. But presence had to be managed, kept at arm's length from the kind of public theater that had made John Gotti famous and then destroyed him. In the end, the family's survival into the 21st century came down to one lesson learned the hard way. The most powerful man in the room is the one nobody knows is there. By the time the new millennium settled in, John Gotti had been gone from the streets for a decade and dead for several years. Yet his shadow still loomed large over American culture. His reign had been short compared to some mob bosses, barely 7 years at the top, but the sheer spectacle of it had burned his image into the public consciousness. Even people who knew nothing about the mafia could tell you who the Dapper Don was. Part of that had to do with timing. Gotti came to power in the 1980s when the media landscape was exploding. Cable news was becoming a constant. Tabloid newspapers were locked in a circulation war, and New York City crime stories were prime selling material. Every time Gotti walked into court in another $1,000 suit with his chin up and a smirk for the cameras, there was a ready-made headline. To the press, he was a gift. He didn't hide from them like the old bosses had. He posed for photos, threw out wisecracks, and made every court appearance look like a red carpet event. For the public, this was something entirely new. The mafia had always been shadowy, secretive, and vaguely mysterious. Here was a man who flaunted it, living proof of the romanticized gangster myth people had been watching in movies for decades. Hollywood took notice. Films like Goodfellas and Casino weren't about Gotti, but their success rode the same cultural wave he helped create. Real-life mob stories were hot, and Gotti was the biggest real-life mobster in the world at that moment. When HBO aired its 1996 made-for-TV movie Gotti starring Armand Assante, it was one of the first times a living mob boss had his life dramatized for millions of viewers. The fascination went deeper than just suits and headlines. Gotti embodied a contradiction that the American public couldn't stop talking about. On one hand, he was a ruthless, calculating criminal who ordered murders, extorted businesses, and ran one of the most powerful crime families in the world. On the other, he was a man who handed out cash to neighbors at Christmas, paid for funerals, and kept his neighborhood safe from certain types of street crime. This dual image, violent outlaw and charming neighborhood protector, fit perfectly into the American gangster archetype. It was the same reason people idolized figures like Al Capone decades earlier. The idea of a man who operated outside the law, yet followed his own strict code, fascinated people in a country that loved rebels as much as it loved law and order. After his death in 2002, Gotti's legend didn't fade, it grew. True crime documentaries, tabloid retrospectives, and mob history books kept his story alive. Networks like A&E, History Channel, and National Geographic produced specials that dissected his rise and fall, often portraying him as both the ultimate gangster and the architect of his own destruction. Then came the Gotti family themselves. In the years after his death, several of his children and grandchildren leaned into the family name as a kind of brand. His daughter Victoria wrote a memoir and starred in the reality TV show Growing Up Gotti, which aired on A&E from 2004 to 2005. The show followed her and her three sons, portraying a glamorous, if dramatized, version of life as part of the Gotti clan. While the reality show played to curiosity and tabloid appeal, it also blurred the lines between crime history and pop culture. For a new generation, the name Gotti didn't necessarily mean the Gambino family. It meant TV drama, celebrity appearances, and magazine spreads. To old-school mob guys, this was a kind of sacrilege, but it kept the Gotti name in circulation long after John was gone. Street-level folklore kept him alive, too. In neighborhoods like Howard Beach and Ozone Park, older men still told stories about Johnny Boy, the kid who came up fast, never took crap from anyone, and made his bones in the Bergen crew. They'd talk about the day Castellano got clipped at Sparks and how the streets buzzed for weeks afterward. They'd talk about the way Gotti could walk into a room and command it without raising his voice. In some corners, especially among younger hustlers, he was treated almost like a blueprint for success, proof that you could rise from nothing to the top of the underworld if you had the brains, the balls, and the charisma. But the smarter ones also saw the other side of the story. They knew Gotti's visibility brought a level of law enforcement attention that made survival impossible in the long run. His image became a fixture in hip-hop lyrics, tattoo designs, and streetwear. Rappers invoked his name to suggest power, wealth, and fearlessness. Shirts and hats with his face or the words Dapper Don popped up, sold in both novelty shops and fashion boutiques. For people far removed from the mafia's reality, Gotti was a brand, a symbol, an aesthetic. In academic circles, criminologists studied him as an example of how media exposure can both strengthen and destroy a criminal organization. His reign was a case study in the dangers of letting ego and publicity outweigh operational discipline. They pointed out how his need for the spotlight alienated some in his own family and turned law enforcement into an obsessed adversary determined to take him down at any cost. Movies kept returning to him too. In 2018, a biopic simply titled Gotti, starring John Travolta, hit theaters. It aimed to tell his story from the inside, portraying him as a man caught between the demands of the street and loyalty to his family. The movie was panned by critics but showed the enduring marketability of his name. Decades after his rise, people still wanted to see his life on screen. There was a darker side to his cultural afterlife as well. For the families of his victims, the glamorization of Gotti was salt in the wound. To them, he wasn't a charming rebel. He was a murderer whose choices left real people dead and communities terrorized. They watched as his face appeared on posters and t-shirts, wondering how the same man who'd ordered killings could be celebrated like a celebrity. Law enforcement veterans had mixed feelings. Many of the agents and prosecutors who'd gone toe-to-toe with Gotti admitted he was one of the most formidable opponents they'd ever faced. They respected his cunning and his loyalty to the old code, even as they condemned everything he stood for. Some admitted privately that taking him down had been the highlight of their careers, not just because of the conviction, but because of what he represented. In the end, Gotti's cultural legacy became a mirror. People saw in him what they wanted to see. Admirers saw a fearless man who lived life on his terms, refused to bow to authority, and gave back to his neighborhood. Critics saw a vain, reckless gangster whose ego cost him his freedom and weakened the very organization he claimed to protect. But perhaps the most lasting part of his legacy is that, in a world where the mafia thrives on invisibility, John Gotti made himself unforgettable. He turned a secretive criminal life into a public performance, walking the line between myth and reality until the two were indistinguishable. That performance inspired movies, songs, and stories that will likely outlive anyone who actually knew him. And in that sense, even though he died in a prison hospital far from the streets he loved, John Gotti got exactly what he wanted: immortality in one form or another. The Bergen Hunt and Fish Club was more than just a storefront social club in Ozone Park. It was John Gotti's launchpad. From the outside, it looked like a neighborhood hangout. Men smoked cigarettes on the sidewalk, played cards inside, watched the races on TV, and sipped coffee in chipped mugs. But anyone from the area knew it was the nerve center of the Gambino family's Queens operations in the 1970s and 80s. It was here that Gotti's reputation was built, deal by deal, beating by beating, handshake by handshake. The Bergen crew got its name from its original boss, Carmine Fatico, a Gambino capo who ran the crew before passing control to Gotti. Fatico was old school, sharp dresser, straight talker, and a man who understood the value of keeping the neighborhood under control. Under him, the Bergen crew managed bookmaking, loan sharking, and hijacking operations. But it was when Gotti stepped up that the crew became something else entirely. In the early 1970s, Gotti was still technically a soldier, but he ran the Bergen crew like a man already halfway to being a boss. His key men were loyalists, guys he'd grown up with or earned alongside. Angelo Ruggiero, nicknamed Quack Quack for his constant talking, was his closest friend and sometimes his biggest headache. Willie Boy Johnson, a towering enforcer with a reputation for violence, was another early ally. There was also Joseph Jojo Carozzo, a quiet but capable operator, and a rotating cast of soldiers and associates who handled the smaller jobs. The crew's bread and butter was hijacking. Back then, the airports, Idlewild, later JFK, and LaGuardia, were prime hunting grounds. Trucks full of electronics, liquor, clothing, and cigarettes rolled in and out every day, guarded mostly by underpaid drivers and warehouse staff. With the right inside information, a crew could grab a load and have it unloaded and sold within hours. The Bergen crew had that information. They had longshoremen, drivers, and union men on the payroll, feeding them schedules and telling them which trucks were worth hitting. Gotti ran hijackings like clockwork. 2 cars, 4 men, fast and clean. No unnecessary violence unless someone resisted. The stolen goods moved quickly through fences in Brooklyn, Queens, and Jersey. Everyone got their cut, and the jobs kept coming. Loan sharking was another steady income stream. Local business owners, gamblers, and anyone else who needed fast cash could get it from the Bergen crew at a price. Miss a payment, and you'd get a visit. At first, it might just be a friendly reminder. Then, a not-so-friendly one. By the 3rd time, you'd either be paying up or picking up your teeth. Gotti didn't need to do the collecting himself. He had guys for that. but if a debtor thought the boss wouldn't show up personally, they were wrong. Gotti believed in making an example when necessary. Bookmaking rounded out the operation. In back rooms and basements, phones rang all day with bets on horse races, football games, boxing matches. The Bergen crew had runners and agents spread out across the boroughs, all feeding into the central operation. The money from gambling was constant. It didn't depend on luck like hijackings, and it didn't require the kind of strong-arm tactics that loan sharking did. But the real power of the Bergen crew wasn't just in the money, it was in the loyalty. Gotti ran his crew like a tight family. If a guy needed money for a wedding, he got it. If someone's mother died, Gotti covered the funeral. If a member got arrested, his lawyer was paid for. These weren't just gestures, they were investments. In the life, loyalty was currency, and Gotti knew how to spend it. He also understood the value of appearance. The Bergen crew wasn't sloppy. They dressed well, even for small meetings. Shoes shined, haircut, suits pressed. This wasn't just vanity, it was strategy. If you looked like you were in control, people treated you like you were. And if you carried yourself like you couldn't be touched, half the battle was already won. Of course, not everything ran smooth. Angelo Ruggiero's mouth got him, and by extension, the crew, in trouble more than once. He loved to talk, sometimes too much, and eventually, those loose lips would give the FBI ammunition against Gotti. Willie Boy Johnson was another problem. Though fiercely loyal, he was secretly feeding information to the FBI for years. Gotti didn't learn the truth until much later, and when he did, it was one of the deepest betrayals of his life. By the early 1980s, the Bergen crew was one of the most profitable in the Gambino family. Their earnings made Gotti indispensable to Neil Della Croce, the family's underboss and Gotti's mentor. Della Croce's protection gave Gotti room to maneuver, expand, and eventually take on bigger jobs, including sanctioned hits that pushed him closer to being a made man and later a capo. The Bergen crew's rise also brought them into conflict. Rival crews in the Gambino family and in other families sometimes tested boundaries. Gotti had a reputation for settling disputes decisively, either through negotiation or by making sure the problem never woke up the next day. That reputation kept most challengers in line. When Paul Castellano was murdered in 1985 and Gotti took the throne, the Bergen crew's role changed. They were no longer just a money-making machine. They were the boss's home base. Angelo Ruggiero remained close, though his legal troubles and wiretap blunders made him a liability. Willie Boy Johnson, despite being an informant, was still seen publicly with Gotti until his exposure. New faces joined, men like Edward Lino and others who were loyal to Gotti's leadership. But running the family from the top meant Gotti couldn't devote himself entirely to the Bergen crew anymore. Responsibilities shifted, and others took over day-to-day operations. Still, the Bergen name carried weight, and its members enjoyed the protection and prestige of being the boss's original crew. After Gotti's arrest and conviction in the early 1990s, the Bergen crew's power began to fade. Without Gotti in the streets, their influence waned, and law enforcement pressure increased. Many members were arrested, flipped, or retired quietly. The club itself, once the heartbeat of Ozone Park's underworld, became a ghost of its former self. Eventually, the FBI shut it down entirely. Yet, even in decline, the Bergen crew's legacy endured. In mob history, they were remembered as one of the last crews to operate with the mix of street muscle, business acumen, and style that defined the old New York mafia. For Gotti loyalists, the Bergen crew was family in the truest sense. Men who had stood by him before the crown, during the war for power, and in the years when every lawman in the city had his face on a bulletin board. And for Gotti himself, no matter how far he rose, the Bergen crew was where it had all started. The foundation of his empire, the loyal soldiers who'd helped turn a kid from the streets into the most famous mob boss of his time. In the mafia, murder isn't chaos, it's policy. Hits are sanctioned, planned, and executed with precision, not passion. There are rules. No killing without the boss's approval. No touching a made man unless the family agrees. No personal vendettas that jeopardize the business. For John Gotti, these rules were never obstacles. They were tools. He understood that murder, used correctly, was less about blood and more about power. Every sanctioned hit in his career was a move on the chessboard, designed to protect his crew, punish betrayal, or position himself closer to the top. Before he was boss, Gotti had already proved himself capable in this arena. One of his earliest sanctioned murders was the 1973 hit on James McBratney. McBratney had committed a cardinal sin. He'd been involved in the kidnapping and killing of a Gambino-made man. That violation demanded a response. The plan was simple enough on paper. Lure McBratney to a Staten Island bar under the pretense of a business meeting, then take him out. Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, and Ralph Gallioni carried out the hit. But like most street work, it didn't go perfectly. McBratney fought back, shots were fired, and witnesses got a good look. Gotti ended up arrested, but his refusal to rat and his willingness to take the fall for a sanctioned murder earned him respect. It also taught him something. A hit sends a message, but so does surviving the fallout. As Gotti's standing in the Bergen crew grew, so did the weight of the names that crossed his desk. He wasn't a wild killer, he was selective. Each target had to serve a purpose. In the mid-70s, during the Gambino wars with rival crews and within their own ranks, Gotti carried out murders that cemented his reputation as a man who could be relied on to get things done cleanly. The biggest and most defining sanctioned hit of his life was, of course, Paul Castellano. By 1985, the tension between Castellano and Gotti had reached a breaking point. Castellano saw Gotti's crew as a threat, too flashy, too independent, and possibly violating the no-drugs policy. When Neil Della Croce, the underboss and Gotti's protector, died in December of that year, Gotti knew the clock was ticking. Castellano's next move might be to demote him or have him clipped entirely. In the old days, killing a sitting boss without the commission's approval was suicide. But Gotti understood that waiting for formalities could mean waiting for your own death. He quietly sounded out key captains to see if they'd stand against Castellano. Enough were willing, or at least willing to stay silent, that Gotti decided to act. The plan for Castellano was pure theater and pure precision. On December 16, 1985, Castellano and his driver, Thomas Bellotti, arrived at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan for a meeting. Gotti positioned himself in a car nearby, watching as 4 gunmen approached the targets just as they stepped out. The shots were fast and deadly. Castellano and Bellotti were both down in seconds. The killers melded into the crowd, and Gotti drove away, leaving chaos behind. The message was clear to the entire underworld. Gotti was in charge now. The hit had eliminated his biggest obstacle and elevated him to the boss's chair overnight. It was the kind of move that defined his reign, but it also broke one of the mafia's oldest rules, acting without the commission's blessing. That breach would earn him enemies who'd wait years for revenge. As boss, Gotti had to sanction hits sparingly. Killing the wrong person could start a war with another family or bring too much law enforcement attention. But some murders were unavoidable. One was Robert DiBernardo, a Gambino captain deeply involved in the family's pornographic distribution business. DiBernardo was a good earner and had a clean reputation, but he got caught in a political trap. Ruggiero, always running his mouth, convinced Gotti that DiBernardo was plotting against him. Whether or not it was true didn't matter once suspicion took root. Gotti gave the nod, and in 1986, DiBernardo was dead. Later, some insiders questioned the wisdom of that move, removing a loyal moneymaker on shaky intel. But in Gotti's world, the appearance of disloyalty was as bad as the act itself. Another sanctioned killing under Gotti was Louis De Bono, a construction contractor tied to the family. De Bono had stopped showing up for meetings and was acting like he didn't need to answer to the boss. In 1990, Gotti decided to make an example of him. The order was simple: find him and make sure he doesn't walk away. De Bono's body was later found in the parking garage of the World Trade Center, riddled with bullets. The message was again unmistakable: ignore the boss at your own risk. Gotti also ordered the murder of Bobby Borriello, his trusted bodyguard, after suspicions arose that Borriello was playing both sides in a growing feud. In this case, the politics of the hit were as important as the killing itself. It was a way for Gotti to show that no one, no matter how close, was above the rules. But not all sanctioned hits under Gotti were about punishing disloyalty. Some were strategic moves in ongoing disputes with other families. The murder of Anthony Casso's associate, Bartholomew Borriello, was tied to conflicts with the Lucchese family. Even in these inter-family hits, Gotti had to tread carefully. Violating peace agreements could start wars the Gambinos didn't need. What made Gotti's sanctioned hits different from those of other bosses wasn't the violence itself, it was the image surrounding them. When Castellano was killed, it wasn't in an alley at midnight. It was in front of one of Manhattan's busiest restaurants during rush hour. That spectacle was deliberate. Gotti understood that in the underworld, perception is as powerful as fact. A hit wasn't just about removing an enemy, it was about showing everyone else what you were capable of. That same taste for spectacle, however, also made him vulnerable. The high-profile nature of the Castellano hit and other killings became central to the FBI's RICO case against him. Wiretaps caught him discussing hits in coded but decipherable language, and cooperating witnesses like Sammy Gravano laid out the details in court. The very moves that had made him feared and respected also helped seal his fate. Inside the mafia, murder is supposed to be business, not personal. But for Gotti, the line between the two could blur. He never forgot a slight, never forgave what he saw as betrayal, and he was willing to use the ultimate penalty not just to settle scores, but to shape the family in his image. Every sanctioned hit was a piece of a larger picture, a calculated step toward power, or a defense of the power he already held. In the end, Gotti's approach to murder reflected his approach to leadership, bold, public when it served a purpose, and always aimed at reinforcing his position. It kept him on top for a time, but in the mafia, every order leaves a trail, sometimes in blood, sometimes in whispers, and eventually, those trails led straight back to him. By the late 1980s, the FBI had developed an obsession with John Gotti. It wasn't just about taking down another mob boss, it was about breaking the Teflon Don, the man who had embarrassed them repeatedly in court and strutted out of every legal battle with his head high and his smile intact. Every acquittal was a black eye for the Bureau. Every newspaper photo of Gotti grinning in a $1,000 suit was salt in the wound. Inside FBI field offices in New York, his face wasn't just on the wall, it was a mission statement. Agents didn't talk about if they'd get him anymore. It was when. The Bureau knew that the old methods, catching him red-handed, relying on unreliable witnesses, staking out the Ravenite social club with cameras, wouldn't be enough. Gotti had survived those tactics for years. He didn't leave a paper trail. He didn't handle money directly. He didn't sign anything. And he'd been smart enough to beat juries, either by charm, intimidation, or clever defense strategy. The new approach was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. Put a microphone where he thought he was safe, record his words, and let him convict himself. The Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy was ground zero for the operation. From the street, it was a modest place, glass door, brick facade, old signage. Inside, it was Gotti's command post. He held court there almost daily, surrounded by his closest men, issuing orders, discussing family politics, and receiving updates on money and operations. The FBI began with outside surveillance, cameras hidden in vans, telephoto lenses capturing everyone who came and went, logs of license plates, and constant tailing of key associates. But these measures only provided circumstantial evidence. What they needed was his voice. The Bureau's first big breakthrough was a small room upstairs from the Ravenite. It belonged to an elderly widow connected to the Gambino family, and Gotti liked to use it for private conversations he didn't want the rest of the club hearing. It seemed safer than the main floor, but to the FBI, it was the perfect target. Late in 1989, a covert entry team broke in. Moving with surgical precision, they planted a listening device inside a light fixture, carefully concealing any sign of tampering. Within days, they were hearing Gotti's conversations, not shouted orders or hot-headed rants, but the calm, businesslike way he talked about everything from finances to murder. The first batch of tapes was promising, but not explosive. Gotti still spoke in a kind of street shorthand. He rarely used real names when talking about sensitive matters. He'd say things like, "That thing, you take care of it," or "He's got to go to the doctor," using euphemisms that agents had to decode. Still, there were nuggets, mentions of certain captains, complaints about money, subtle references to past killings. The tapes proved something the FBI had long suspected. Gotti wasn't just a figurehead. He was directly involved in day-to-day decisions and the sanctioning of hits. The Bureau doubled down. They bugged cars, apartments, and payphones. They placed informants in rooms near Gotti whenever possible. They monitored his movements constantly, learning his habits. When he arrived at the club, when he went to dinner, which restaurants he favored, which routes he took home. But surveillance alone wasn't going to seal the case. They needed someone inside. The first major informant in Gotti's world was a shock to everyone. Willie Boy Johnson, a longtime Bergen crew enforcer and one of Gotti's most trusted friends. Willie Boy had been feeding information to the FBI for years, though not everything, and never in a way that directly implicated Gotti in murder. When Gotti eventually learned of his betrayal, the hurt ran deep. But Willie Boy's cooperation showed the Bureau that even inside Gotti's tight circle, loyalty had cracks. Then came the biggest coup, flipping Sammy the Bull Gravano. But before Gravano turned, the FBI was already building a mountain of evidence through wiretaps. One of the most important bugs was planted in 1990 inside the Ravenites' back room, where Gotti liked to meet with Gravano and consigliere Frank Locascio. The FBI had identified it as the real nerve center of Gotti's operations. Installing a device there was risky. It meant breaking in while ensuring no one suspected a thing. When the new bug went live, it delivered exactly what prosecutors wanted. Over weeks and months, they captured conversations in which Gotti spoke openly enough to tie himself to murders, extortion, and internal discipline. He criticized captains for being lazy, talked about who had to go, and recounted past disputes in ways that made his role in settling them obvious. One particular tape would become a dagger in his defense. On it, Gotti discussed the Castellano hit, referring to the murder almost casually, but in a way that made it clear he had orchestrated it. He also spoke disparagingly about Gravano, calling him greedy and suggesting he might need to be put in his place. These words, captured in Gotti's own voice, were devastating. In the mob, perception was everything, and the perception these tapes gave was that Gotti micromanaged his empire and took personal credit for its deadliest moves. When the Bureau finally made its move in December 1990, arresting Gotti, Gravano, and Locascio outside the Ravenite, they did so with supreme confidence. This wasn't like past cases. There would be no reliance on shaky witnesses or circumstantial theories. This time, the evidence was literal. Gotti had hung himself with his own words. In the months leading up to trial, the tapes were played over and over by prosecutors, not just for their content, but for their tone. The jury heard a man who was calm, in control, and unapologetic about the way he ran the Gambino family. They heard him describe people as obstacles to be removed. They heard him talk about profits, discipline, and power like a CEO in a boardroom. Except, the boardroom was the mafia, and the corporate restructuring often ended with a body. The FBI's surveillance war on Gotti was one of the most meticulous in organized crime history. It required months of planning for every bug, layers of deception to protect informants, and endless hours of tape review to piece together the full story. In the end, those tapes didn't just convict him, they humiliated him. The man who had built his legend on never being caught, on always outsmarting the system, was brought down not by a rival, not by an assassin, but by a microphone hidden in a room he thought was safe. It was the ultimate irony. The Dapper Don, who loved the sound of his own voice in public, lost everything because of his voice in private. By the spring of 1992, the trial was over, the cameras were gone, and the verdict was carved in stone. John Gotti, boss of the Gambino crime family, was convicted on all counts: racketeering, 5 murders, and conspiracy. The life sentence without the possibility of parole wasn't a sentence in the traditional sense. It was a burial alive. The court that had once been his stage now felt like the last room he'd ever walk out of as a free man. Gone were the grins for the press, the sharp quips to reporters, the perfectly tailored suits. From that moment on, Gotti belonged to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. He was sent first to USP Marion in Illinois, one of the most secure facilities in the country. Marion wasn't built for comfort. It was built to break men. 23 hours a day in a cell barely big enough to pace in, 1 hour of exercise in a cage, constant surveillance, and minimal contact with other inmates. For a man used to commanding rooms and controlling an empire, it was a world reduced to concrete and steel. But Gotti didn't fold. He adapted. Even locked away, he carried himself like a boss. In the yard, other inmates approached him with a mix of fear and respect. Many had grown up hearing his name in headlines, and some still couldn't believe they were sharing space with the Teflon Don. He didn't run the prison, but he didn't blend in either. He spoke politely when spoken to, never acted desperate, and never allowed anyone to see him weak. Still, the isolation was a weapon, and it did its work. The FBI and Bureau of Prisons knew the Gambino family would try to keep him involved in operations, so they monitored every call, every visit, every piece of mail. Gotti tried to communicate through coded messages to his son, John A. Junior Gotti, who was stepping into leadership on the outside. Some orders got through, some didn't. The control he once had over the family began to slip. On the street, the Gambinos were struggling. Law enforcement pressure hadn't let up after his conviction. RICO cases continued to gut the family, and rival crews were making quiet moves into their territory. Junior was trying to keep the machine running, but he wasn't his father. The charisma, the presence, the sheer force of personality that had made John untouchable in the streets, those things couldn't be passed down like a title. Inside Marion, Gotti faced a betrayal that cut deeper than any legal loss. He learned that Sammy the Bull Gravano, his underboss, his right-hand man, was thriving in the witness protection program, free after serving only 5 years despite admitting to 19 murders. It wasn't just the betrayal itself that burned. It was the fact that Gravano's testimony had been the nail in his coffin. To Gotti, it wasn't law enforcement that had beaten him. It was treachery. Years passed and time began to wear on him. In 1998, Gotti was diagnosed with throat cancer. He underwent surgery and radiation, but the disease came back. By then, he'd been transferred to the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, a place where the government sent high-profile inmates with serious health problems. It was cleaner than Marion, quieter, but it was still prison. Even sick, Gotti kept his pride. Guards who worked there later recalled that he never asked for pity. He dressed neatly, shaved every morning, and refused to let the illness strip him of his dignity. But the cancer was relentless. The man who had once been broad-shouldered and barrel-chested grew thin. His voice, once sharp and commanding, turned hoarse. Still, when visitors came, he sat straight, locked eyes, and spoke as if he were still sitting in the Ravenite Social Club, planning the next move. On June 10, 2002, at the age of 61, John Gotti died in his cell. There were no crowds, no cameras, no grand exits, just the hum of prison machinery and the cold finality of the end. For all his defiance, all his battles, the man who had ruled the streets of New York with style and swagger died in federal custody, just another number in the Bureau of Prison system. The news hit the streets fast. In Howard Beach, his old neighborhood, people stood on corners talking in low voices. Some mourned openly, remembering the man who had paid their rent when they were broke or sent envelopes for funerals. Others saw it as the closing of a dangerous chapter, a man who had brought more trouble to the city than it needed. The funeral was held under heavy law enforcement surveillance. Gone were the days when a mob boss could be sent off with hundreds of cars in a public procession. Still, family, friends, and loyalists came. They kept their heads down, spoke in hushed tones, and avoided giving the FBI a chance to photograph too much. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, the same cemetery that held many of New York's most notorious mobsters. The stone was simple, just his name, his birth year, and his death year. No titles, no boasts, no reminders of the empire he once ruled. In the years that followed, his legacy became a battlefield. To law enforcement, Gotti's downfall was one of the greatest victories in the war on organized crime. To many in the underworld, he was a cautionary tale, a boss who let his ego put the family in the spotlight, drawing heat that never cooled. To his loyalists, he remained the last great street boss, a man who had lived and died on his own terms, never turning on his people even when it meant spending the rest of his life in a cell. On the streets, his name didn't disappear. Young hustlers still spoke of him in the same breath as legends like Lucky Luciano and Carlo Gambino. Rappers dropped his name in songs. His face appeared on t-shirts, posters, and tattoos. Movies and documentaries kept his story alive, sometimes romanticized, sometimes torn apart, but always told. But the truth, stripped of myth, was more complicated. Gotti had been a brilliant tactician in the rise, a bold and decisive leader who understood the psychology of power. Yet as boss, he had also been reckless, allowing the media to make him a star and the FBI to make him a priority. His reign was the last time a mob boss ruled with such open visibility, and the lesson his life left behind was clear. In the modern world, the mob survives in the shadows, not in the headlines. For the Gambino family, the post-Gotti years were about adaptation. They abandoned the public bravado, tightened their circles, and shifted into lower-profile operations. No one who came after him tried to be the next Dapper Don, because they all knew how that story ended. Even now, decades later, John Gotti's name carries weight. In the neighborhoods he once ruled, older men still tell stories about him walking down Mulberry Street during the feast, about the day Castellano fell, about the trials where he walked out smiling. They tell these stories with a mix of pride and sadness, knowing they'll never see another boss like him because the world won't allow it and the life can't survive it. In the end, John Gotti's legacy is split down the middle. Half legend, half warning, he is remembered as both the man who brought the mafia into the public eye like never before, and the man whose light burned so bright it consumed everything around him. He wanted to be unforgettable. In that, at least, he succeeded.